My name is Hayden Higgins. I'm the communications manager for the WRI Finance Center, and it's our pleasure today to present some new research from the Finance Center. We're obviously part of World Resources Institute, where our mission is to figure out how to envision an equitable and prosperous planet driven by the wise management of natural resources, create a world where the actions of government, business, and communities combine to eliminate poverty and sustain the natural environment for all people. And obviously today we're going to be talking about the Green Climate Fund. This publication follows in a string of illustrious research, including coming out of the Finance Center from WRI about the Green Climate Fund. So we previously published on issues of governance and as well as spotlighting the need for a healthy replenishment of the Green Climate Fund. Today we're going to be talking about direct access. This is something that I learned quite a bit about in the course of supporting the publication, and I'm sure you all will be excited to learn what Gaia and Molly have to share with you. So without further ado, I see we're up to a healthy number of participants. I'd like to kick it over to Gaia to get us started. Gaia is one of our senior associates. All right, take it away, Gaia.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Hayden. Thanks everyone for joining. We are really excited to talk to you about this topic. I like that I see some familiar faces and plenty of new ones in the participants list, so welcome everyone. We're just going to launch straight in to a presentation which will walk you through our paper, and then we will have a period for questions and such at the end. You are at the end of our presentation, please do raise your hand in the little function to do so, and we would love to call on you to hear from you directly, and we'll unmute your mics at that point. If something comes up during the presentation that you had a question about, you can also put it in the chat. So to start off, direct access. I think that probably many people on this call know what that is. I know how important it has been to the GCF and to climate finance in general, but just to give a brief introduction, it is a process by which we try to make sure that climate finance, especially in this case from the Green Climate Fund, is flows as directly as possible to those who need to benefit from it. And so the process, I think you can go to the next slide, right, is one where the donors provide money to the fund then provides money to national or regional institutions instead of going through first a international organization. So it's, for example, a situation where the Green Climate Fund might give money directly to an environment ministry or environment fund or an NGO or a private organization in a country, whereas the other international process is one where the money would go, for example, to a development bank or the UNFCCC or an international, a UN organization, not the UNFCCC, or an international NGO or something like that. And then the money would go maybe to a local NGO or to some other organization in developing countries, since GCF only does fund developing countries. So why would we want this, and why would we put that in place? Well, it not only, it's I think a matter, the answer to that question really depends on who you're talking to, but I think everyone generally agrees that it's a positive thing, and if you can make it work. It can be positive because it can be more efficient, it can empower and get resources to really important organizations in developing countries who have the sort of domestic expertise, knowledge, and capacity to really make a change within their own countries. One can say it's just the right of these organizations to get access, or these governments to get access to the funding as directly as possible within the context of climate change. So there are a lot of different reasons why we really support direct access, and I don't want this presentation or this report to, or paper to come off as something where we are criticizing the concept itself, or even how the GCF has really, been trying to put this into place. It's admirable that the GCF has been trying to do this, and it is in the spirit of trying to help the GCF and all involved be more effective with this process that we are doing this this paper, and that we've been doing this research. So the research is essentially, the question that we're trying to answer is, how can we improve the GCF support for direct access entities to better ensure that a diverse set of organizations can access project funding? Next slide. And the GCF is not the only one that has done this. The Adaptation Fund, and to a lesser extent, the Global Environment Facility, has pioneered direct access. I'd say especially the Adaptation Fund has become known for this. And but the GCF has been doing it at the larger scale, in part because the GCF is just a larger fund. So they've accredited quite a few more organizations at this point and have, much larger projects. And so the question of how to make the process fit and work is one that is particularly pressing at the GCF. The GCF's accreditation requirements are fit for purpose, as we call them. So that means that you don't have to be accredited. You don't have to show an ability to do a really big project. You can show an ability to do a smaller project and still become accredited. And this has allowed a large number of organizations to become accredited, which at this point is, I think, somewhere, well, it's around 60 some organizations, a bit more, and more are up. There's a big pipeline as well. So this includes, as I said, public organizations, private organizations, NGOs, some regional development banks, the smaller banks. The bigger regional development banks like the Asian Development Bank are considered international. Next slide. So, and this is from our paper, but this is the number of different types of organizations that are accredited. So government ministries, for-profit, etc. It's relatively well spread out in a way, although many of them are public in some way, shape, or form, be that a national bank, a national ministry, or some sort of semi-public organization like a national environment fund, or like a think tanky type organization that is funded in part by the government. So there are, as I said, over 60 accredited entities at this point. The real trigger for why we wrote this paper was that so far, 2/3 of those entities haven't reached project approval for actual project funding. And there's a lot of different reasons for this. I think we're going to go into some of them, but we do think that it's an issue. You can see here between direct access and international, there's around 30% of the direct access entities have had at least one project approved, whereas 57.5 or closer to 60% of the international organizations have had projects approved. Even though there's more direct access. So there are more direct access entities that are accredited than international, but around the same number have gotten projects. This is essentially what the situation is right now. This means that around 80% of projects that have been approved have gone to international organizations, and around 80% of the financing. And there might be some, there are these numbers. One should also consider the fact that, of course, international organization projects will probably be bigger in many cases than domestic. So there's some explanation for that difference in the amount of funding that goes to the different ones. And then some international organizations will also work in multiple countries. And so it's more likely that they would have more projects than the direct access entities. So, we're not saying that it would necessarily at this point naturally be 50-50, but the difference is stark. And so we're essentially wanted to see, okay, well, what can be done to better make sure that the direct access entities actually get projects approved and don't just receive accreditation, which in itself is a difficult task, but we decided that since there are a lot of accredited entities already at this point, we wanted to look more at the project approval piece. So we also looked at the fact that direct access entities, the number is not increasing in terms of the relationship between international and national, or rather direct access entities. If anything, it seems that it might be decreasing a little bit over time in terms of the percentage of the projects approved, be they direct access versus international. And there is an upcoming board meeting next week, which probably most of you are aware of. And there are 5 more entities that are going to be up for accreditation then, but only unfortunately 2 of the 14 projects are from direct access entities. So, you know, this follows the trend that we've been seeing about, you know, a low number of direct access projects up for approval. The GCF has recognized that it is going to be challenging for direct access entities to access funding, and so they have put in place 4 different project initiatives. And these are the ones that we went through in our paper. These initiatives aim to help not just direct access entities in some of the cases, but generally direct access entities to access funding. So it's readiness support, project preparation facility, simplified approval process, enhanced direct access pilot. I'm going to hand over to Molly, who's my co-author, and she's going to go through each of these 4 and then our findings, and then I will come back towards the end to go through our recommendations.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, so I'm going to walk through the 4 different programs that the GCF has set up and kind of talk about our key findings and the bottlenecks that direct access entities face when trying to access these programs and support finance. I'll start by talking about readiness support, because that's the first form of support that most direct access entities get when they come to try to become accredited to the GCF. This program was created in 2014 to help countries put into place the systems needed to access the GCF. It was originally developed for activities like helping countries set up their nationally designated authorities, but now is more utilized for things like national adaptation planning and helping direct access entities become accredited. There's been a new strategy that was put into place for 2020 to 2021. And the new budget is $224 million. So it's a nearly 70% increase year on year compared to 2014 to 2020. So there's more financing available for countries to do some of these various readiness activities. The significance for direct access. So readiness support goes through nationally designated authorities, and direct access entities can access this financial support by requesting it from their nationally designated authorities. They can use it to support mostly accreditation, but also formulating project ideas, which is used to a lesser extent. And we talk about in our paper, kind of one of the bottlenecks for entities is on this project identification and concept note development piece. And it's, like I said, the first form of finance that most entities will encounter when they're going to the GCF. So 40% of all direct access entities have received some form of readiness support. The percentage is higher at 55% for direct access entities who have a project approved. So there's clearly some link between entities that have received some form of readiness support and those that have gotten projects approved. For our paper, we spoke with 43 direct access entities, several international entities, NDAs, and what was clear from our discussions was that the support is helpful if it can be accessed. And so a piece of this readiness support, like I said, it's mostly used for accreditation support. Our paper focuses on project approval. So to a lesser extent within this readiness bucket of funding, readiness projects can also support project development, So far, 13 entities have used it to help with identifying project ideas, and to a lesser extent, developing concept notes. As you can see from the chart, there was kind of an uptick in 2017 and 2018. A lot of the first accredited entities who were accredited in 2015 and 2016 accessed finance and got first projects approved. So it's clear that this form of support was helpful for those initial entities. So a couple of key takeaways based on our discussions. So the focus right now in readiness is on NDAs. They are the key authority within their country, but they are also responsible for submitting all applications for readiness support, which in some countries can be a bottleneck if the NDA is unresponsive or if they have a lot of other planning, climate planning priorities. And there's also a lack within readiness of support for concept note development to access any other form of finance at the GCF, whether it be the project preparation facility, getting an actual project approved. You need to have an endorsed concept note, and that can be quite a hurdle for a lot of entities who might lack financial and human resources internally to get that off the ground. The other issue we found with the readiness support was that it can be a really time-consuming process. Considering an application just for this readiness form of support requires a theory of change, risk management analysis, procurement plan, monitoring evaluation plan, line item budgeting. There's a lot that goes into just readiness applications, which are for 100 to 300,000 just to develop maybe a pipeline of projects. And also readiness funds go through a delivery partner and are not intended for entities. Most entities don't receive this support directly, but receive it through consultants. And readiness funds aren't intended to just support core staff within direct access entities. This can be an issue as developing all of these proposals requires a lot of human and financial resources to be dedicated to working with the GCF. The other issue is for the delivery partners themselves. They receive 7.5% in delivery fees and can act as an executing entity for the project, but it's sometimes difficult to say what work is a part of the project and what work is oversight. And based on our discussions with some international entities, the current structure for delivery partners has kept some entities from being encouraged to act as delivery partners, and DAEs have oftentimes stepped into that role, but it becomes tricky if they have to use their own resources to help make sure the readiness projects are delivered. And then there's also little flexibility in terms of between line items. They have to get approval from the GCF, and given the delays and the long timelines, this can sometimes mean that a lot has changed by the time a project is approved. So the next facility at the GCF that I'm going to talk about is the project preparation facility. As the name would suggest, it's for project preparation. The program has 40 million allocated to it. In its current form, it's a pilot. You get up to 1.5 million per project, but proposals have averaged around 600,000. So far, 23.4 million of that 40 million has been spent down with 37 requests. We'll get into this a little bit, but concept notes are, you have to have an endorsed concept note from the GCF to access this facility. Concept notes, several reports have noted that concept notes alone frequently cost around $100,000, let alone the cost associated with the full proposal, which is part of the reason this facility was developed. The project preparation facility can cover things like pre-feasibility studies, gender studies, risk assessments, and developing M&E systems. And so this facility was particularly developed in mind for entities like direct access entities. All of the direct access entities, or all entities are eligible, but kind of, again, was developed in mind for entities without resources to utilize to develop projects. 12 of the 62 current direct access entities have accessed the facility, but of those 12, 6 had some form of, had either gotten a project approved or had gotten some form of support before this. So it's kind of clear that accessing the facility is easier if you already have some experience with the GCF, whereas the design was more intended for entities who are having trouble getting their first project approved. The idea for the project preparation facility is not new. The other climate funds, Adaptation Fund, GEF, CIFs all have some form of project preparation funding, and to varying degrees of difficulty in terms of accessing them. Adaptation Fund maybe being the least difficult to access versus others. So to get an endorsed concept note, which you need to then get project preparation funding, you have to go through, essentially, as this chart shows you, several different departments within the GCF. So concept notes are reviewed by the origination and structuring team. They also are reviewed by either the Division of Mitigation and Adaptation or the private sector facility. And you also have to get an endorsement by the Climate Investment Committee. And sometimes if your concept note is rejected the first time, you have to start back over and go through this process, which can be quite time consuming. And you need that concept note to then put forward a project preparation facility grant. Some key takeaways from our paper. So the project preparation facility has largely been accessed by entities who already have a project approved, and a persistent hurdle for entities who want to get a project approved and need access to PPF funds is getting this concept note endorsed by the GCF. Again, no small task, because a lot of things are put in the concept notes, and concept notes can range from, they're 45 pages on average, but can reach 110 pages, and that's excluding annexes and other supporting materials. And there can be pretty long timelines to access the PPF funds, even once you have the concept note. It kind of depends on the back and forth about the budget and other admin issues, but it can take 3 to 15 months, even once you've gotten that and you've submitted your PPF application. So the next program I'm going to talk about is the simplified approval process. So the GCF has 2 ways that you can access full proposals once you've either access readiness funds or project preparation funding, or you can go straight to these proposal processes. But the simplified approval process was developed because entities were struggling to access the full proposal pipeline. It was launched in 2017, kind of developed in recognition of the barriers that accredited entities were facing in getting through the full proposal process. When board members said they wanted to apply best practice in order to reduce the time and effort needed in the preparation, review, approval, and disbursement procedures of small-scale projects and programs. So the simplified approval process only applies to projects that are asking for 10 million in GCF contribution and that have a low ENS rating. So currently 61% of direct access entities are accredited for micro and small categories, so projects up to 50 million versus 24% of international entities. So the simplified approval process would prove particularly relevant for direct access entities. Its significance for direct access is that it also is one of the only fund pieces of the GCF that has a target specifically for how much of the funding should go to direct access entities. The board has said 50%. Right now, only 30% of projects in the SAP pipeline are from direct access entities. And like I said, more direct access entities would apply for this funding given the size requirements. So one of our findings is about how long and expensive the SAP proposal process still is, even though it was meant to simplify and make it easier for entities to access funds. The cost of drafting a SAP proposal can also range from 100,000 to 150 and go as high as 400,000. And again, this is after you've gone through the concept note and gotten that endorsed, which is also cost money. And on average, the SAP proposals have not proven much shorter than the full proposals. As the chart on the right shows you, the average number of proposal pages is about the same, and the amount of funding is much lower per project. One of our findings was that the current word guidance, what the SAP proposal in its current forms essentially does is reduce the maximum word limits for each of the sections within the proposal, but doesn't actually reduce the amount of information that you have to provide, which essentially, it in essence hasn't changed the amount of information you have to provide, which means you still have to do a lot of the same work up front. The other part is that it also, on the timing part, the board had requested that SAP be a shorter process with less information. So it has the same amount of information and it also has a similar processing time. The independent evaluation unit at the GCF found that it's only an 8% shorter processing time for SAP proposals. So it still takes a year to get a SAP proposal approved versus a year and 1 month for full proposals. And that time difference essentially goes away when you look at low E&S proposals in the full pipeline versus SAP. And the proposals are getting longer, not shorter. For example, in 2018, there were 10 optional annexes in the SAP, and now there are 22, and 9 of them are now required. A recent proposal had to submit 20 of the 21 annexes, so it's still quite long. So our key findings were basically that there's similar steps in the review process for the regular and streamlined processes. There's also similar requirements, and the length of time to get it processed is about the same. So the last program at the GCF I'll talk about is the Enhanced Direct Access pilot. It was approved in July 2015, along with other requests for proposals. It's meant to further devolve direct access and originally had a target of 10 projects in 5 years. Currently, there's only been 2 projects that have been approved. The 10 projects were to be spread amongst a $200 million pot, so about 20 million per project. And we're also meant to include 4 pilots from SIDS, LDCs, and African states. So enhanced direct access remains incredibly popular amongst the entities that we talk to as a concept. The idea is essentially that direct access entities put a project proposal forward to the GCF, and then they're able to then decide the sub-projects that they fund through a grant award or on lending if they're a private entity. And this is significant for direct access in that it was the first request for proposal that allocated resources for direct access entities. And as I mentioned, it was a popular concept from the beginning. This just illustrates the other requests for proposals that the GCF has put forward. By some metrics, this is one of the least successful of their RFPs in terms of the amount approved to date, and also in terms of the number of total funding requests. When you contrast it with the SME request for proposal, it had a lot fewer total funding requests. There are still 14 projects in the pipeline, but as I mentioned, there's not the same level of response as other RFPs received. This is an example of the governing body you have to have in an EDA project. So for an EDA project, you have to have there's additional operations and governance requirements to access the funds. In addition to regular project approval requirements, you also have to create an operations manual that illustrates how you're going to oversee all the finance. And that creates an additional thing that you have to create on top of the normal project proposal process, which can be quite lengthy. While an EDA allows DAs to choose which projects to grant award or on-lend to, you also still have to provide a pipeline of sub-projects, a potential pipeline of sub-projects in your proposal, along with risk mitigation systems and immunity processes. And in addition, you're also encouraged to have some form of long-term finance, which for a lot of entities can be a deterrent. So again, part of our key findings are that there's additional operations and governance requirements to access these funds. There's a lot of full proposals that have some form of devolved funding, both from international entities and from direct access entities. So the unique value add of EDA can be called into question in that way. There's a lack of clarity also for these EDA pilots around the activities that qualify for funding. Some entities tried to put forward capacity building, funding for capacity building, which makes sense since they're giving grant awards and on-lending to entities who might not have done these kind of projects. But there's been pushback for those kind of activities in the past. And the funding size and type may be limiting interest. So for entities accredited for small projects who can receive up to $50 million from the GCF, a $20 million cap on GCF financing may also be limiting, because 70% of direct access entities can receive more than that in terms of financing. And it is possible that it's possible that the pilot program is somewhat limited in terms of the number of entities for which the pilot is a viable and attractive funding option. Right now, there are around 27 of the 62 entities that are accredited for small and micro, and also accredited for grant award and on lending, leaving really around 40% of entities for which this kind of a project applies. So for these reasons, it's not always clear the benefits of the EDA pilot versus going the full proposal route and doing a default funding mechanism in a full proposal. And now I'll pass it on to Gaia to talk more about our recommendations.
Yeah, thank you so much, Molly. So I'm going to run through our high-level recommendations, and then we can open up for a discussion, and happy to go into some more details on these if that is of interest. So next slide, Molly. Right. So one of our big recommendations is around transforming the readiness and project preparation support. So as Molly talked about, we do see a gap of support for concept notes, but also a somewhat complicated process whereby you're supposed to access readiness funding, which originally was structured more for accreditation support and support for NDAs to set up processes. There's also, sorry, readiness funding that goes to NAPs and different kinds of country programs and entity programs. So there's a lot of different things readiness is used for, but project development is not necessarily one of them. That's supposed to be the project preparation facility, but there you have to have a concept note ready. So we suggested let's take a step back and look at how would one design this support if you were starting a little bit more from scratch and looking at it more sort of rationally in a way. And one of the things we said is, look, the division right now of this readiness preparation, readiness and the project preparation facility is not necessarily so logical. So that is one thing we're looking at here is, could you reformulate and look instead at, okay, how do we make sure that entities receive support for accreditation, support to identify projects and get the process going, support to develop projects, including early concept note development, and then get the proposal out the door. So one of the, also one of the important things we recognize is you get through accreditation. It's a big, it's a big process. We haven't gone into that here, excuse me, but it's not insignificant, and it takes a lot of time and money in itself. And then you have to start over and write a proposal for project funding, and a proposal for project preparation funding if you are going that route. And so we said, look, why don't we just give direct access accredited entities an amount of money automatically upon accreditation so that they can deal with, for example, looking at, that sometimes 10, 20, 50 project ideas that are coming their way from different people that want access to the GCF, and they can really delve into and select those project ideas that are most relevant. They can potentially hire somebody onto their team for a year or so, to help with this process. Just the things, the daily activities that need to take place in order to help move from accreditation to projects, and give that money essentially as recognition that they have now achieved accreditation, rather than based on a new funding proposal. Excuse me. Then we have one application for concept note development and project preparation funding. The project preparation funding would be released once the concept note is complete. One could allow entities to explore various concept notes to see which funding is, or which proposals turn out to be relevant in the end. Because when you're putting it together, a concept note, you might be doing additional research or a project proposal, and you figure out actually this project is not so great, but this other one that we are also working on is better. So allow some flexibility in how, in selecting different concept notes and putting forward the one that you really are the most excited about, essentially, after having done some studies. So that's what this figure is showing. Next slide, Molly. In addition, we want to make sure that preparatory funding can be used where it is most needed. So that would include staff time for the direct access entities themselves, which sometimes can get some funding at this point, but in general, that's not what the funding can be used for. So you have direct access entities who are, the staff is doing their regular jobs plus doing the GCF jobs without necessarily having additional resources for that until they have received full project funding. And this relates a little bit to a question that came up, I see in the chat around international entities. Make sure that there's access to high quality information, expertise, and peer exchange. The GCF is unique. If you have applied for funding from the GEF or the Adaptation Fund, you will have some idea of what it maybe is like to get GCF funding, but the GCF process is not like the other processes, in that there are different requirements, more requirements, and so really close assistance from people that are familiar with this process is really helpful in getting things through. This can be GCF staff. There could be secondments of GCF experts to direct access entities. And there is some support like this now. There's a 15-day access to experts through the GCF for entities that have really promising concept notes and that they want to turn them into full proposals, but this should be expanded and just make sure that entities really are able to get the access to the expertise that they need without having to go, submit a project proposal or a concept note proposal or a readiness proposal and then get tons of comments back that they have to deal with and then go back and forth that way, but rather knowing upfront what the requirements are would be much easier. And some of that can be through peer exchange, including with other direct access entities, because a lot of times, there might be challenges that are relevant specifically to smaller organizations based in developing countries that are not the same challenges faced by larger, well-resourced international and regional organizations. So while we definitely, in recognition of this question about how can international entities better support direct access entities, yes, that is a question. And I think there are a couple different ways. One would be for certainly to make sure that direct access entities or international entities are providing the expertise and knowledge that they have because they are such large and well-resourced organizations. But we also need to recognize that some of the challenges facing direct access entities are actually unique. And so peer exchange with other entities in that similar vein or who are dealing with similar problems is really valuable as well. Next slide. In terms of the simplified approval process, yeah, let's make it actually simpler than the regular process. So this can be continued streamlining within the Secretariat and ITAP of the review process, which has been the approach so far. But I think what also really needs to happen is that the actual information requirements need to be reduced as well, which has not really been an emphasis so far. So, you know, on the one hand, when the GCF has word or page requirements, they should mean something. Right now, you know, when somebody submits something within the word requirement, they're often asked for a lot more information. And so those word requirements don't necessarily end up limiting the length of the project proposal. And also, in looking at the template, there are ways in which one could reduce the amount of questions that entities have to answer to make sure that we're really honing in on the information that's necessary to make sure that the GCF, you know, has enough information, but not additional information that is not really necessary. So basically, if we're saying that these projects are smaller and lower risk, then they should have to provide less information than the bigger, higher risk projects. Next, thanks. And then finally, on the enhanced direct access modality, you know, this modality, I think Molly implied and mentioned, it's been very popular on the one hand. I think the idea, the concept has been really popular, but the actual execution has not been, you know, there have only been a couple approved so far, and Molly went through some of the reasons, but that we think could be playing a role. But so our recommendations relate to those reasons. One is to make sure that the enhanced direct access modality is actually attractive and that it lives up to the enhanced concept of, you know, this is a way in which entities get more autonomy, that they can do things that are different from what they would be able to do with regular GCF funding. And then maybe look also at the current, so there aren't necessarily funding caps in terms of the size of the project. Overall, there's a cap on the size of the GCF funding, but the pilot project, you know, was a certain amount. So essentially there's an implication that this is only for smaller projects, and which Molly mentioned would be limiting for a lot of different direct access entities. So if this is really something that the GCF wants to support, then we should be limiting the cap on the pilot and encourage bigger projects with more autonomy to the entities. You know, the enhanced direct access pilot is quite an interesting experiment in really supporting the concept of direct access, right? Going from, okay, we accredited these entities to we're going to trust this accreditation, and we're going to allow the entities more autonomy in their decision-making in terms of how the money is used. So next slide, I think that is it. So as I mentioned, we're happy to go into either our findings or our recommendations in more detail. And so we've been talking to you for a long time now. So hopefully you are ready to have a conversation. And so to do so, please either you can put it in the chat, or even better, so we get to see your faces, or at least you hear your voice. You can raise your hand. I think you have a button somewhere on your screen to do so. And that will alert us that you had something to say. And in the meantime, while you're thinking, I'm going to read through some of the questions. So another question that's come in is, what is the next step in the opinion from the GCF Secretariat? So we did go communicate with Secretariat quite a bit as we were reviewing this paper or writing this paper. They were reviewers. We sent them drafts to get their feedback and input. So, the Secretariat is aware of our recommendations, and I think some of them are within the remit of what the Secretariat can do, and some of our recommendations would need to be done by the board. Some of our recommendations are supported by some people in the Secretariat and maybe less by others. It's not a monolith of an organization, but I think there is an interest within the Secretariat by many people to make also the Secretariat's job easier, to be honest, and to lighten up some of the requirements that the Secretariat now works really hard to try to implement. In terms of our next steps, we have also reached out to all the board members of the GCF, sent them the paper, and we'll be having some discussions with some of them. The board meeting is next week, where they, for example, will be discussing the SAP, but we will continue to have conversations with the Secretary and the board going forward, especially when there is an opportunity also at the board meeting to discuss these specific topics. And we would be more than happy to continue also talking to the Secretariat about in more detail maybe what they could do to implement some of these recommendations. And I see another question about what is the typical annual budget for NGOs who start this process? And then let's jump to Graciela first, since you raised your hand. Can we have Graciela?
Hi, thank you. Thanks for the interesting presentation. I'm from the Mexican Fund for the Conservation of Nature. We are a direct access entity. We have submitted our first SAP full proposal, and it's one of the 2 proposals that are going to be in the board next week. So we are very excited. It will be very interesting to know how long does it take for the direct access entities from the accreditation to the presentation of their first concept note, to try to understand how long it takes to start the process, no? Because I do not necessarily think that it's wrong that it has been decreasing from 2005, maybe because there was a big batch of direct access entities that were accredited around 2005, no? So maybe they are only able to operate and to implement 1 proposal per time, and maybe in the next, in the next years, there was like a gap in presenting their next proposals. So I think it will be interesting to understand the correlation between accreditation and how long it takes to submit the first proposal.
Yeah, thanks. Molly, maybe you can start to answer that question.
Yeah, I'll start with not necessarily that question specifically, but Graciela, what you were referring to a little bit as far as the timing for when projects kind of dropped off. There were actually less accredited entities at the beginning, and then they more quickly received project approval than some of the later ones who have received project approval. So as far as that timing is concerned, it's a little longer. On the question of the concept note, we struggled with this a little bit because some of the information is publicly available and some of it is not. So you can see for some entities when they've submitted a concept note, and others the process was private. So we don't have the exact number on that as far as the average is concerned. But yeah, so as far as the entities at the beginning versus now, again, the process has actually kind of gotten longer in contrast with the entities at the beginning. We think this is in part both because there were fewer entities, so there was more GCF time and resources from the Secretariat to focus on the entities that had just gotten accredited. And also a little bit political in terms of a push initially to just get some projects for those entities approved. So I don't know if that totally answers your question or if Gaia has more nuance to add. But.
No, I mean, it's a good question, Graciela. And yeah, unfortunately, I don't have those exact numbers. But as Molly explained, it is not necessarily just the case where it's a certain period of time for entities to go and then they get one concept note. I mean, as we mentioned in the beginning, there's still a large number of entities that have maybe submitted a concept note or many concept notes. None of them have been approved because they've not been strong enough. And how do you get them to be strong enough? You know, there's a lot of different pieces at play here. So I hope that helps. There's a number of questions coming in the chat, so hopefully we will not miss any of them. But I started to answer the typical annual budget for NGO to start this process. I assume you mean like how much would an NGO need to have as they jump into the process of developing a project proposal. And I would think that it varies. Sometimes the NGOs don't necessarily have a huge budget, but they do access external funding outside of the GCF process from other development partners, which is something we haven't mentioned yet, but a lot of entities do get support from like the German government or whoever, you know, bilateral donors. And I think a lot of NGOs also don't think it's going to cost so much, and then they end up jumping in and having to spend a lot of their own time on it. But we don't really have numbers as to like how much money they would generally have. Ideally, one would have, say, you know, depending on what country you're in and how much staffing costs in your country, like enough money to at least pay for somebody to spend full time on this for, you know, a period of time to just manage all the things that need to be managed. But again, the situation is different in different countries. I think the question about the average cumulative length of time, oh, Lars is, so I'm going to prioritize people that raise their hands because they are active participants here. So Lars, let's give you the floor. Lars Roth, are you there?
It looks like your mic is open, but there's not any levels coming through it. Lars, if you could, if you're on a headset, if you could unplug that or plug it in.
How about now? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, that's wonderful. So my name is Lars Roth and I represent Sweden at the GCF board. I don't want to take much time. I just wanted to thank you for a fantastic presentation. You know, I mean, you certainly do the number crunching. You come up with some very relevant findings as well as recommendations. So I have full support for what you are proposing. I hope we as the board can do our homework and to implement as many of those as possible. I mean, what has maybe not been mentioned and what I raise constantly is, of course, the need for an accreditation strategy, which is currently missing because it is quite clear just looking at the number. It is not an issue about a lack of direct access entities being accredited. I mean, they account for about 60% now, 60 plus out of 103. But it is a matter of funding proposals coming through from those entities. And so maybe it wasn't the right entities that were put forward as was suggested by the independent evaluation unit, at least in some cases. Maybe it was more about putting forward an entity that would easily pass the accreditation requirements, but at the same time they did not have a project pipeline, and so that does explain why for many entities we have yet to receive a funding proposal. So maybe an accreditation strategy could address this. Maybe there should be a requirement in order to be accredited to also have an indicative project portfolio submitted, because in the end we want to accredit entities that can support the GCF in fulfilling its mandate. I think the idea that was also mentioned here of international entities, they of course already have a requirement or at least an expectation to collaborate with with the direct access entities, but there are no incentives currently in place. So I don't know to which extent this is happening, and so obviously that is something we would want to see further developed. There was the idea of twinning arrangements, which I am a strong supporter of, where actually I would want to see more funding proposals put forward by not only one, but at least two entities accredited by the GCF. So far, we've only seen one such proposal, but that could be a way for an international entity to work together with a direct access entity, which would also help direct access entities to build up the necessary capacity in order to be able to put forward funding proposals by themselves. And the proposal recommendation made on post. Accreditation financing in order to stop here.
No, sorry. You just froze for a minute, which is why I said, uh-oh. Okay.
I was done.
Okay. Thank you so much. I am cognizant of time. We just have a few more minutes and we have some questions, but I can try to jump in quickly, and then Molly, if you have something to follow up, to combine some of these questions. So some of them are, again, about the length of time that it takes, and the data that we have presented is the data that we have. We did want to be able to present, for example, how long it took for entities from starting the very early process to getting projects approved, but that information is not that easy to get. You'd have to speak with, we did speak with almost all entities, but still you have to have a definition of when to start. And we have, and it's not easy to do this across all of them, but we have examples of, some entities started the process when the GCF originally accredited them in the first batch of accreditation, and they still don't have a project approved. So the length of time can really be quite long, or there's some that have managed to do it quite quickly and have managed to get several projects approved at this point in time. So it varies tremendously, but basically it takes, I would say the theme is that it takes longer than you expect. So if you expect a long time, it's gonna take even longer. In terms of the 15 days, this is something that the project preparations facility has been trying to implement in recognition of the fact that there is need for more support for concept notes. And so they said, okay, well, under the current rules that we have and the funding that we have, we're available to provide some technical assistance to those entities that have really good concept notes, but they're just not quite good enough to get them to the project preparation approval stage, project preparation financing approval stage. There is more information on that to be able to be accessed from the GCF. And then, and how do I think that do we think that the barriers are putting off DAAs from submitting and preparing proposals? It's hard to say. On the one hand, there continues to be a lot of excitement about the Green Climate Fund, I think because it is really the main player still on the stage where you can get a significant amount of funding if you're successful. And so I wouldn't want to say that people are completely disillusioned, but of course it does give people pause when they are thinking about trying to access funding, when I think they can see that maybe, for example, other organizations in their country have tried and are still trying and after several years and still haven't gotten funding. Those that have become, so there are two steps, right? There's the ones that have not yet been accredited, and then there are ones that have reached the accreditation and then they need to submit for project proposals. They have the motivation to try to actually get some funding now because they've spent a lot of time in becoming accredited sometimes as well. So I don't know that I want to say that they're completely disillusioned, but certainly there's frustration and just a wish for, I think everyone wants the GCF to succeed. Everyone believes a lot in the GCF, and there's just this frustration that, oh, but this should be more streamlined and this should be easier. So, like, can't we make these changes to make it better? We're 2 minutes over. So yes, the presentations will be made available as well as the recording. We'll send out the presentation to everybody who's here, and I think the recording will likely be available online. And yes, thank you from Cyril also for your input here in the chat about something that we also found to be an issue, which is the uncertainty. So the rules are ambitious, but they're also a bit unclear. And we do mention this in our paper and have done so less now, but the lack of clarity and the lack of knowing how long it's going to take is something that is an issue as well, right? If the GCF was able to say, look, this is going to take you 2 years, so plan for that. These are the steps in that process. That would be one thing, but they're not able to do that at this point in time. And so it just further exacerbates the frustration that some entities have with the process. Thank you all so much. I know you're busy people and you probably have to run off to other meetings, but we are more than happy to continue this conversation also with anybody and who would like to do so. And we are available via email and however else one finds people these days. So, and if you want to hear this presentation again, we're doing it again in around 10 hours. So.
Great, great work, Gaia. Great work, Molly. I know this is the result of, I think, over a year of study and research. And so we're really happy that we're able to share this with everybody. I know there's been, questions about where folks can find the presentation and recordings. Once we have the recordings, we'll post them on the event page where you first registered for the webinar. I'll also just go ahead and proactively send that out to everybody who registered via email. So yeah, once again, congratulations to Gaia and Molly, and I hope that we can be in touch with everybody. We have a lot to learn. I think this publication, like Gaia said, relied so much on the conversations with everybody around the issue, and we're certain that continuing those connections can only help the WRI Finance Center as we continue to work to shift financial flows to be more sustainable. So thanks, everybody. We'll be in touch.